Welcome to Selling Secrets, the show about action movies and spy films. Our mission is to look at the movies we love and go behind the scenes to find out what makes a successful Hollywood blockbuster. From interviews to movie reviews, marketing campaign analysis, and more, Selling Secrets is your home of spy films and action movies. Do you know what it takes to make a Hollywood blockbuster successful? Let's find out together on Selling Secrets. Hello and welcome to Selling Secrets. I'm your host, Josh Gay. Joining me today are the hosts of one of my all-time favorite podcasts, the Spyhards Podcast. It's Agent Scott and Cam the Provocateur. I had a fantastic time talking all things spy movies with Cam and Scott, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. So, let's just dive right into it. Here's my interview with Agent Scott and Cam the Provocateur, hosts of Spyhards Podcast. Joining me today, I have Scott and Cam from the Spyhards Podcast, aka Cam the Provocateur and Agent Scott. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you.
Hello, Josh. Thank you for having us.
It's fantastic to finally get to speak to you guys. You know, I've been listening to Spyhards for some time now, so it's really cool to actually meet you face to face over video, but nonetheless, it's very cool. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's very disappointing. It's very disappointing when you see the video. I know.
Well, you're not wearing tuxedos, and you know, I was expecting like some spy stuff, but no, it's very cool. Thank you, guys.
We are not Dave Zaritsky.
No. David's dressed to the tent, isn't he?
Yeah. He's always putting his best foot forward. I'm whatever the opposite of that is.
Likewise. Yeah, if you're going for spy lifestyle, we're more Remo Williams than James Bond.
Well, I mean, my house is more or less James Bond. It's just empty with bits of knickknacks. It's not really a luxurious apartment, that's for sure.
I see the other side of my room right now. It's horrible.
Well, for those who don't know who you are, can I get you both to introduce yourselves and tell me a little bit about the Spyhards Podcast?
Well, as you beautifully alluded to, I'm Agent Scott, and the other guy you're hearing is Cam the Provocateur, and together we are the Spyhards Podcast. So basically, the idea is every week we pick a spy movie and just to review it, and then we ask a question. Will that film make the N.O.C List? And I always hand over to Cam to explain what that is.
Yes, the N.O.C List is our tortured acronym for Need to See Official Classics. I'll let you figure that one out. I'll give the listeners a second just to ponder that one. But yes, N.O.C was a term we took from the first Mission Impossible. And essentially what we're looking to do is create the N.O.C List, which is like the pantheon of all-time great spy films. And so at the end of every episode, after we've had the conversation and broken the movie down, talked about the behind the scenes, we determine whether it belongs in sort of the all-timers club, which can be flexible. I think a lot of people would think, well, it has to be a Goldfinger or a North by Northwest to make the list. But we're looking at making one that's more inclusive, that really kind of touches on every aspect of the spy genre, includes family films, all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, because you've covered a variety of films. You haven't just, as you said, spoken about the North by Northwest. You know, you've covered all the Triple X movies, so nothing's off the table, right?
No, those Triple X ones were actually a really fun series to revisit, and we had some great interviews with the writers of the first and the third one. So can't complain about the Triple X coverage.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into a bit more about the show, I'm hearing some different accents, and obviously we've got some time differences here. So I'd love to know how you guys met, being on the opposite side of the world. Can you tell me how the podcast came to be?
Well, you would think you would hope it was something to do with spy movies. But I can burst that bubble right now. It really isn't. Cam and I met at a Star Trek convention in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the year 2013, there is the big Las Vegas Star Trek convention put on every summer in Las Vegas by Creation Entertainment. And I think it's the biggest one in North America. Yes. I started going in 2012. Scott had gone to one in the 2000s, but I met him at the 2013 one. And we were kind of, part of groups that kind of came together. There's essentially like 10 of us who have gone on vacation together every year since 2013, really, where all of us had started to form. And that's been the case until the pandemic, of course, put the brakes on that. But so Scott and I would spend every summer together really geeking out about Star Trek. The spy stuff didn't really come up till later, right, Scott?
No, not at all. But the actual time we first met, I have told many different versions of this story, so you can try and figure out if this is the correct one. But that's the spy. That's the fun of the game. So this version you're getting may be the truth, may not be. But we met when I was being dragged out of a convention center for shouting that George Lazenby was an underrated Bond. And security tried to pull me away, and Cam rescued me. That may be the truth. You'll never know.
That warms my heart as an Australian to hear.
Not how I recall it, but I'm willing to go along with that version of the story.
I love it. That's fantastic. Well, seeing as you met doing Star Trek, and you've obviously got a love for Star Trek, what drew you guys to spy films? Obviously, there's a love for Lazenby as well, but instead of going down the Star Trek route and doing a Star Trek podcast, what was the deciding factor to do a spy film one?
I think it probably had something to do with the fact I'd done a Star Trek podcast since 2014 weekly, and I couldn't do a second one. It
Fair enough.
It would have broken me as a Star Trek fan. So it was essentially once the pandemic kicked in, Scott and I started talking, and it was like, oh, have you ever thought about doing another podcast? And it was like, oh, this could be a fun project to do. And when at one point, Scott was doing a rewatch of Bond months before we were having these conversations. And we just talked on WhatsApp over the course of his, visiting these movies or revisiting in some cases. And it kind of, as the conversations kept going about another podcast, he said, what about a movie podcast? What about James Bond? And we just decided there's way too much competition for Bond. And it's also limited. You have 25 official films plus, a couple oddities here and there, but it's again very limited in scope. So we just decided to expand it to spy movies because you got Mission Impossible, you got Bourne, you've got XXX, you've got Spy Kids, you've got all these other things, plus just Hitchcock movies and all these other various, assortment of spy films over, the last several decades. So that made it very appealing.
Absolutely. And that was similar sort of, I guess, to when I started doing this was, I sort of started deciding, well, all right, I'll do a James Bond podcast. And then likewise with the scope, there's only so much you can do. So I can definitely empathize with that. And I can see why you guys went that. Out of everything, though, why spy movies? Like, what draws you guys to the spy genre as a whole?
It's a toughie because me and Cam could talk about just films. It could have been a film podcast because me and Cam both watch a lot of films. Before we were watching lots of spy films every week, we were going to the theaters quite often to see whatever's regularly out, and we would talk about those films. But I felt like we had a shared love for Bond. Cam's was much more of a vibrant love. I was brought up in a household with an N64 playing GoldenEye with my 4 brothers. It's just, that was how we got introduced to Bond. Cam grew up in a household where they were watching Roger Moore films and, chasing each other around with, fake sharks and things like that. Like outrageous stuff happened in the Smith household when they were growing up. They even wrote a Bond song between him and his sister, which I've yet to hear, but we are going to reproduce sometime on the podcast down the road, which I'm looking forward to.
We also shot like a home James Bond movie where I played Jaws. So yeah, like Bond is a big part of my childhood.
Absolutely. That's phenomenal.
And so I think we just needed to have, because if we go broad and speak about podcasting for a second, there are a ton of movie podcasts. They are literally a dime a dozen. And we wanted to do something that not only we were both interested in, because we both love spy movies just in general. I've always been a big fan of the Bonds, but also like the Bournes and the Mission Impossibles. Have always been something I've loved watching. And Cam was the same. And it's also just good to have a focus, because I think you can really, in this podcasting world, if you cast your net so wide, I just don't think anyone will really ever like tune in. Whereas I can say, after 2 years of doing this, I'm getting okay at spotting what a good and a bad spy film is.
And I mean, Scott really did pitch hard to do a podcast about talking animal movies, but I think the spy films were kind of the safe compromise.
Well, we do have a talking animal spy film now, don't we? Was it The Bad Guys? I think that'd be classed as a spy film.
There are loads. There are literally loads. There's cats and dogs.
I forgot about those.
I wish I'd forgotten about them.
Spies in Disguise, that's another one.
Have you covered any of them for the show yet?
Not yet. It's like, when do we feel like plummeting our ratings? When is the perfect time to do that? So I'm sure it'll fall at a quiet Christmas season or something like that.
We have a bit of a fun history on the podcast of doing our own legs in. It's quite fun to watch if you like chart it, because we'll have a gangbuster episode like, I don't know, Goldfinger. And then we'll follow it up with something like Remo Williams. And people are just like, what is this? They've just tuned in for Goldfinger. They've come in to listen to us talk to Calvin Dyson. It's all going well. And then we just follow up with a mildly racist 80s American spy film. And you just think, but we love to just do our own legs in all the time, because it's just fun to go bouncing around this world of spy movies and to keep people guessing. And we let you know every week ahead of time what we're going to be covering, so you're not completely surprised. But I don't like the idea of like just sequentially going through films. I'd rather bounce around. We have an order in mind, but I just like this sort of discovery. 1 week we're in the 1930s, next week we're in the 1990s, and I think it's just interesting listening, and interesting for me and Cam, because every week we get to watch a completely different film,
which is awesome.
Yes, that was a big concern of mine when we started. It's all well and good, the first few months, but at a certain point, does it feel like I'm watching the same movie every week, which would get very tiresome. If you're seeing the same tropes just play out week after week after week. And that hasn't been the case. Like, they really do run the gamut. And then I don't really know that like spy movies are that specific a genre, because spy movies can be anything. They can be comedies, they can be rom-coms, they can be thrillers. We haven't really found a horror one, but I'm sure at some point someone will make one. It's like they can be sci-fi, they can be anything.
Absolutely. Well, seeing as you guys are the experts on the genre, and you've covered everything from, as you said, the 30s to the now, how has the genre evolved over time? And can you speak to, I guess, some of the positives of that evolution, and maybe some of the tropes that you'd like to see come back?
I see Scott's thinking. Do you have an answer, Scott?
Well, I've always got an answer. I'm just trying to come up with a more eloquent one, Cam.
Oh.
So that's always the trick. No, I'll just go with what I think. How have they evolved? Well, you can chart it going back from the noir period, where it seemed to focus a lot on sort of detective stories and things like that. The Man in the Trench Coat, that was kind of how a lot of the 30s films, although like you had Mata Hari, which is a completely different story in the 30s, a female spy being done back then, which is great to see. But I mean, compare it to how it is now. Most spy films now seem to fit into two categories. It's either an action spy film a la James Bond, Jason Bourne, Mission Impossible, or it's a dark thriller like a Le Carre adaptation, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, something in that realm. We just had All the Old Knives come out a couple of days ago, or last week, I believe, on Amazon Prime, and that's another Le Carre-esque thriller. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground, but you go back to something like the 80s, the 80s is such a rich realm for effing weird spy movies. We've got things like Gotcha, Jumpin' Jack Flash. I could keep naming things. Remo Williams, there you go, it comes up again. And there's a comedy there, there's a cop story, all kinds of different things. So I feel like it's really... I feel like Hollywood have figured out what seems to make money and have stuck with that. And there's less experimentation now than there used to be in the sort of 80s and the 70s as well, with sort of the paranoia stories.
And I think also when you look at the 90s, you have the Austin Powers stuff, which is so popular and really does kind of change the way the genre operates, where it was something like you can't take a lot of the more 60s-esque spy films seriously anymore. You know, you had obviously Austin Powers, but that followed up with like Undercover Brother, and there was, Grimsby. There's this kind of run of spy movie spoofs. And so like, I feel like now what we get are, as Scott said, you get the very serious ones that are like, we take this very seriously and we are trying to ground it very much in a real world. And you can look at, the dramas that Scott named, but even the Bourne franchise did that. And you've also got like these more fanciful approaches that are still trying to deconstruct the genre, because whether it is the Daniel Craig Bond films, which set out to essentially reframe the entire concept of James Bond and to underline, elements that might be outlandish and try to ground them in a way or to comment on them. And then also something like Kingsman, which is like, hey, we're doing Roger Moore, James Bond adventures, but we're underlining the absurdity of all these moments and just stopping short of winking at the audience. It's like they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too, these things where it's like we want to deliver the thrills that these, types of spy stories can have, while also acknowledging to the audience, we know exactly how these stories work.
And also, it's interesting. Like if you chart it back just to the 60s, like if you go now, it's not hard to find a spy film. They are coming out at least a few a year. But in the 60s, you couldn't move between spy films. Every single film in the theaters was either some sort of early sci-fi or a comedy, romantic comedy, or a spy film, because of the James Bond boom. So there's a rich tapestry of spy films in the 60s as well that also go into different genres. But I feel like that's sort of dissipated in recent decades.
Well, I think the superhero genre has really taken over there. Obviously, genres come and go, and there's you go from the spy films to maybe the gangster films to the cowboy films and your techno thrillers of the early 2000s, and now we're in the superhero genre's sort of moment in the sun, for a better word. I hope that spy films can come back strong. We're seeing little elements of that, I think, with some of the Marvel films, and trying to interweave that with the likes of Black Widow, or heck, even the new Moon Knight series as well. There's little spy elements that play through that. So going back though to the podcast, now that we've spoken spy movies in general, you mentioned it before that you've got a very unique rating system based on Mission Impossible, the N.O.C List. Personally, for each of you, what would make a successful spy film that ends up on the N.O.C List? And then on the other side of the coin, what isn't?
Remo Williams is not.
Well, it's also kind of useful to mention that we do have a secondary list.
Yeah,
it's a small list, but it's the list of the worst films we've ever seen, and that's called the Disavowed List. There's only a few films that have that honor, dishonor, but you have to be pretty bad to get onto that. Some of the ones include like the Men in Black sequels; they're awful. Harry Palmer TV movies. One of Our Dinosaurs is missing. Sorry, everyone who's a fan of that film, but it's a racist piece of trash. Don't at me. But in terms of the N.O.C List, I wish I could give you some sort of objective tick box I go through mentally. But a lot of the time, for me personally, I'm sure Cam is different, because we do butt heads quite a lot on what we think is going on to the list, and we do have to sort of talk it out. It's just a very subjective thing. At the end of watching a film, I will go, yes, this is one of the all-time greats, or I won't. It happens very quickly. I don't and ah particularly. I just seem to just subjectively know it. And And then it's down to us. Usually if we have a guest, it's good because they also get a vote and that will kind of sway where it goes. But if it's just me and Cam, we just have to go head to head until we work it out.
Yeah. And I think for me, there are a couple things that bounce in my head. One is like, is this movie doing a spy movie story in a way that just feels like next level? Like this is that involving or that exciting or that observant about the lifestyle of a spy, just in a way where it feels like I would be putting this movie, on a top 10 list of the year if I watched it in a given year. Like this is just a fantastic movie. So that is an easy way to tip it onto a list. If you just come across a North by Northwest, you're like, okay, well, clearly like this movie is just absolutely, brilliant. Of course it's going to make a list, or Goldfinger, something like that. I also try to take historical importance into account as well. That doesn't guarantee it a spot on the list, but there are certain cases when we talked about like Our Man Flint of the James Coburn spy series. It is a movie that I would not say is, standing next to Goldfinger or North by Northwest. But when you look at the importance it had on the genre, informing the idea of sort of the lighthearted 60s spy kind of spoof, not really, kind of homage to the genre, it's so important. And so many of its imitators were looking at that movie. So I go, that is a really fun movie that I enjoyed a lot. Is it a 5-star classic? Probably not, but it had a huge influence on the genre. And I think that's something you have to take into account. So there are occasionally movies that I'll come across where I'll go, this is not one of my favorites, but I look at the ripple effects it had and how important it was. And I feel like it's something people should be seeing. So I try to mix it up a little bit. Yeah.
I like that. And I think it's a much more, is holistic the right word? Overview film rather than it just being a 1 to 5 star rating. You take into account all of those elements. I think that's a really cool way of doing it. Well, out of all the films that have made the N.O.C List so far, personally for the both of you, is there one each that you'd say, yep, that is the definitive spy film?
I feel like North by Northwest is the easiest answer in some ways because it's like the best movie on the list. But I think also when you say Goldfinger, that's another one that's hard to quibble too much. Like that's one thing with the Bonds is like there's much more of a conversation when you talk about some of those other Bonds. When we're doing like Thunderball or You Only Live Twice, there's an ongoing battle about those ones in terms of placement. Whereas something like Goldfinger is so perfect as a Bond film and just creates a template that we're still working through. You mentioned, the Marvel movies. In some ways, the Marvel films are indebted to a movie like Goldfinger. So it's kind of a slam dunk choice. So I think those are the two that jump to mind for me is just like such head and shoulders above the competition picks.
It's all about Spy Kids.
Robert Rodriguez.
I guess 3 Days of the Condor is another one too, though. That was a very easy add-on, but yeah.
I mean, I'm just looking at the actual N.O.C List now in front of me, the films that have made the list. And I mean, it's hard to pick out one that I would raise above the rest, I have to say, because one of the things we like to say is, I think Can came up with this term, but they didn't come up with the phrase, it's all killer, no filler. These are films you could sit someone down and chances are they're going to enjoy the heck out of it. And they're going to get an idea of what the spy genre is like if they've never seen a spy film in their life. But I look at some of the other ones we've had, like The Spy in Black from 1939 with Conrad Veidt. Fantastic film. No one's ever seen it, except for people around that time. It's forgotten about, really. Maybe film historians have seen it, but it doesn't really get played anymore. Fantastic spy film. A lot of the people that are making spy films now should watch that just to remind themselves of what makes a good spy film. The Day of the Jackal with Edward Fox. Fantastic again. So I don't know if I can really pick one to sort of lift above. North by Northwest is the easy answer. Cam's right. It's like, I mean, we haven't tackled Casino Royale, well, either of them yet, but I have a feeling one of them might make the N.O.C List, and that might be another easy answer. We do a lot of interviews on the show, and we have a lot of guests as well, and we often ask them, like, what's their favorite spy film? And a lot of the time, you hear North by Northwest or Casino Royale.
Yeah, and there's something to say about that, isn't there?
Yeah.
What about you, Josh? What do you think is the best spy movie of all time?
Loaded question, as you said. Well, I think Goldfinger stands right up there. They were doing a run of all the old Bond films in cinemas in the lead up to to the release of No Time to Die back before it was delayed here in Australia, and we had all the pandemic fun stuff. And
oh, that's right, you guys got it really delayed in comparison to
it was almost 6 months after everyone else, so that was lots of fun. But yeah, Goldfinger came out in cinemas, and my fiance, she's not an action movie fan or a Bond fan. Like she'll put up with them and watch them with me begrudgingly. But I said to her, like, if there's one movie that helps you understand why I love the franchise so much and why it's had such a cultural impact, it has to be Goldfinger, because it really laid the groundwork for the franchise to come. And as you guys have more eloquently said than myself, it laid the groundwork for an entire genre moving forward as well.
I did the same thing with my other half, and I took her to see Casino Royale 67.
Oh, I
wish that was a joke. I genuinely did. I was. I was hoping she'd leave me like about halfway through, but she was really into David Niven. I don't know why.
I'm jealous of you guys getting these like Bond retrospectives. That is not something that happens very often in Vancouver at all.
I'm going to see Never Say Never Again in a few weeks. I literally can't wait to see it in theaters.
Oh my God. What are you doing to yourself?
I love it. I'm a big Never Say Never Again defender, I have to say. Better than Thunderball.
Really? Wow. Okay, that's controversial.
No, it's insanity is what it is.
It's Thunderball is one of those Bond films for me that really, I struggle with. Like, it has so many good elements and then just gets bogged down towards the end. I think it's a hard one for me. So I can see why some people would enjoy Never Say Never Again, because it is a bit more of an action romp. But yeah, it's definitely not, for me at least, the more perfect film. Well, look, you mentioned obviously that you've had guests on in the past, and you've interviewed several filmmakers and screenwriters. You've had on some incredible talent. Most recently, you had on Janis Metz and Olin Steinhauer when you were covering All the Old Knives. Can you tell me a bit about the experience that you've had speaking to some of these incredible talents behind the films?
Well, I'm going to take this one, Cam.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, you'll find out when you hopefully do get around to listening to us. Cam doesn't book anything or anyone for the show. It's all me.
That's
so
right.
I take all the credit for the interviews, but I do make him have to edit my voice for several hours a week. So I think it pays off. Like he pays his dues at least. The interviews are probably my favorite part of the show right now. Much as I love speaking with Cam about spy movies, I didn't
know this. This is crushing for me to hear.
Yeah, sorry, buddy. Sorry. The one I did by myself last week was terrific, by the way.
Oh, the one you made me edit. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, they all started because I emailed Nicholas Meyer. Now, Cam and I are big fans of Star Trek, as we mentioned. And Nicholas Meyer made Star Trek 2, Star Trek 6. He wrote Star Trek 4. But he had a small attachment to Tomorrow Never Dies. We'd read about this. And we just reviewed the film, and I think it's where this information came up. And so I went to Nicholas Meyer, I sent him an email, and he said like, yeah, I did do that. And I said, well, would you like to talk to us about it? And he said, yeah, let's do it. Now, they say don't meet your heroes. Well, we did. And he was very nice. And that kind of got the ball rolling. I'd never interviewed anyone in my life. Cam has a background in film and TV, so he's been reviewing films for many years. So this was fine. I was very nervous. I was sweat.
I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. I mean, I went to journalism school, so like interviewing people wasn't something outside the norm. But as you said about meeting your heroes, it's like, I'm going to be talking to Nicholas Meyer on Zoom. Like, that terrified the hell out of me.
But that got the ball rolling. That was the first one. And I thought, well, this is an interesting avenue. And then we started to just slowly, I think we did like 15 last year. We've done about 8 or 9 so far this year. So we're trying to up the ante as we go. And what we try to do now, if we can, it's not every week, but every so often we will have an interview attached to a film. So some of the ones we've had, like we had On Her Majesty's Secret Service, we reviewed over Christmas, and we had John Glenn, the editor on the film, second unit director, to come on for an hour and talk to us about making On Her Majesty's, working with George Lazenby, because there's so few people that can really talk about that experience now, apart from George Lazenby himself. And of course, we got to speak to John Glenn. Who's going to say no to that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's Bond royalty, right?
Exactly. And again, very nervous. But we've also done, we've spoken to, give me some examples.
I think Jeff Kane was a really good one. Jeffrey Kane, who co-wrote Goldeneye. And I mean, again, this is all the props to Scott, because Jeffrey Kane hadn't really given any interviews about Goldeneye, and came on and basically broke down the whole writing process that he went through. And he was very candid about the experience and gave us some great insight into in particular, there was a scene where Bond meets the Zukovsky character played by Robbie Coltrane, and how he had written a completely different introduction to that character that he was very proud of. Did not make the movie. They ended up doing something completely different. And he was, you could tell it bugged him, and he told us the whole scene. And so insights like that have been really, really, I think, just crucial to giving us a little bit of legitimacy as well.
Absolutely. And hearing those stories as well, you sort of go, because that introduction to Zukovsky for me in the film is, I mean, it's iconic, the line about the Walther PPK and everything. But then hearing that wasn't the first choice, you go, well, how do you improve upon perfection already? So those conversations you guys are having are very eye-opening. Is there one thing that you've learned from all of these creatives who've been involved in making the films that has informed your perception of the genre or of what is a good spy film?
I can answer that question in two different ways. The first is, I mean, what have I learned from talking to these people? And that is that I do prefer talking to people that worked behind the camera, behind the lens. Because we've had a lot of screenwriters. We mentioned the Triple X. We've had the 1 and 3 screenwriters. We had is it John August, was the chap from Charlie's Angels?
Yep.
Yeah, he wrote Charlie's Angels. We've had the director and the writer from The Avengers from the 1998 Ralph Fiennes film. That's Abomination. But they helped us break down exactly where it went wrong. And by the end of those 2 interviews, I almost wanted to see the film again. And the film that they laid out sounded a lot better. And you could tell they still cared about the project and they wanted to talk about it. Whereas we've spoken to a lot of like actors and people, and they've all been great. I'm not throwing shade at anyone, but you can see where the passion a lot of the time is. We had Dan Mindell, an award-winning cinematographer. He's done the likes of Mission Impossible 3, Spy Game, The Enemy of the State, Star Trek, Star Wars, The Force Awakens. The guy's been everywhere. And we spoke for we cut it down, but close to 2 hours with the chap about working on films. And he was just gushing about everything that he could about the spy films and everything else. And that's the kind of energy I just have absorbed and drawn from. Now, if you're asking me like how it's influenced how I see spy movies, I think the one thing I've learned is that everyone seems to come to spy movies from different angles and what they want from it. And that's maybe why we end up with such a vast range of films we cover on the show. Because the word spy can infiltrate lots of different genres. And, Nicholas Meyer, after talking about Tomorrow Never Dies, started speaking about Jean le Carré. And that's his favorite type of spy stories, where some people have come on and just spoke, for ad nauseum about Bond films, because that's their favorite type of spy films. So I think that's probably what I've learned. What about you, Cam?
Well, also, you also realize that sometimes it's just driven by, these are characters we were interested in creating. We aren't really huge spy genre people. Like, I don't know, like I've seen them. I like the Bonds, but I don't think about them that much. And yet, some of these people have made very iconic spy films. It's more driven by an interest in a character or a concept or something like that, and how the spy genre is so malleable that it just allows them to work within it without having to sit there and read Le Carré novels and watch every single James Bond film to be able to make a movie that belongs in that sort of arena. So I think that's a big part of it too. And that spy films, as I said, it's a very elastic genre, so they don't feel like limited by the genre. It's like, Scott talked to people who made, all the other knives and, or all the old knives, I should say. And it's like, that is a character drama set at a table for the majority of the film. And I seriously doubt they were looking at Goldfinger being like, how do we do this properly?
Well, the director said he wasn't a fan of spy films particularly.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's just a job, and that's fine.
But then you have someone like Olin Steinhauer working alongside of him, who is, I mean, you'd call him the 21st century Le Carre almost, in terms of his style. It's very, very similar and character driven, as you said. So having, someone like that work alongside someone who's not a spy fan, but is, I think, was it Yanis? He worked on I can't remember, it's going to bug the crap out of me now, but he worked on like a murder mystery series, I think it was. And like, you can see how they gelled so well together. And yeah, definitely. And that interview with, bloody hell, I've just completely Dan Mendel. Sorry, I'm doing well this morning, guys. That interview with Dan Mendel was really, really like eye-opening for me, because my background prior to getting into advertising was I was working as a camera operator down here, and just sort of hearing the process and hearing him talk about that stuff was incredible. So thank you from a creative, because that was phenomenal to listen to.
No, thank you for listening. Yeah, sincerely.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I don't want to keep you for much longer. Obviously, it's the holiday weekend, so I know you've got things to do with families, and it's probably pushing 11 o'clock over there in the UK. So we'll wrap it up. I do have one question for you though before we wrap up. Is for the both of you, if there's one film of the past, let's say 10 years, from the spy genre that you'd recommend audiences of this show listen to, what would that be? And it doesn't have to be from the N.O.C List. It could be a disavowed film if you want to go down there and torture my audience. But if there was one film each, what would that be?
I can start here. I think people are going to check out Bonds. They're going to check out, these franchise ones. But there was a movie that came out last year that we covered called The Courier. And, the episode did fairly well for us, but it's a movie that's on streaming now. And I don't know that it's gotten the attention it deserves. There's been a number of spy movies that have gone to streaming, like Without Remorse was another one, the Michael B. Jordan film, and All the Old Knives is obviously out there now. We've covered a few of them, but I think The Courier was doing something really interesting with a, real true life story. It stars Benedict Cumberbatch, and it's about a friendship and how that is sort of complicated by the Cold War. And we did an episode where we talked to the director, Dominic Cook, about that film. And, we, as I said, like, it was a pretty popular episode of the podcast, but it's not a movie I hear people talk about. And I think it's one that spy fans would be, well served checking out.
Agreed. I think I watched that very recently. I've been going back through the Amazon catalog that I haven't watched, and phenomenal film. So I totally agree with you there.
I'm just going to go with Spy Kids again.
He said 10 years.
Oh, yeah. Spy Kids 4, obviously, all the time in the world.
That's actually 11 years now.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. I do have an actual answer. I'm sorry. I'm just being jovial. I'm going to go with 2015 Steven Spielberg film, Bridge of Spies. I think in a world where we're all very well educated on Mission Impossible and James Bond, we know what those films are. We know what works in those films. We know what doesn't work. Quantum of Solace or Mission Impossible 2. We understand the goods and bads. I don't think a lot of people have really delved into what a good dark spy thriller can be. That Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy would be another one I would go to, but we haven't covered it on the show yet. So I'm just going from ones that we've tackled. Bridge of Spies, we also had an interview with the writer Matt Charman, and he's a massive spy fan, so we spoke a lot about that. But just working with Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, a fantastic group of people that were all very passionate about telling this man's story. And it's just an interesting story that's wrapped up in the spy intrigue of the Cold War. It's the perfect telling of that. Yeah, it's interesting because when you think Spielberg, you think of his much, much, much bigger films. But when you watch Bridge of Spies, he's able to bring that Hollywood star-making sort of directorial talent to telling this quite intimate spy story. And I think it's one of the favorite ones that we've tackled on the show when it comes to the N.O.C List. So yeah, I think that would be the one in the last 10 years I'd point people out to. And it's on streaming here in the UK. I can't speak to North America or Australia, but even if I'd say, pay and rent it.
Absolutely.
It's one that also, it's also one that gets like overshadowed just within the canon of Spielberg. They tend to look at much of his bigger work, and even like late career Spielberg, there's very few that people hold up really, really high. And I think Bridge of Spies is one that it doesn't get the attention it deserves now. And I suspect one day it will.
I agree with you there. It's, people more tend to lean towards those big bombastic films that he does rather than the introspective character dramas. And that one is just a phenomenal performance. And it was Mark Rylance in the film, I think, was just pitch perfect throughout the whole thing. So yeah, I definitely agree with you both there. So
star-making performance for Mark Rylance in that film. I did have a question for you, Josh, if you don't mind. Well, you mentioned Goldfinger as kind of your pointing to your favorite Bond film of all time, but also favorite spy film, more or less, I would say. But what are you looking for when you reach to your DVD, your Blu-ray shelf? Do you go for more of your explosive action Bonds and Mission Impossibles, or do you reach for the Le Carre adaptations? Because we walk the line between the two on the show.
Yeah.
But I'm interested to know what people out there really like, because some people have a definite choice. And you can tell from the people who listen to the show.
I think it really depends on the mood I'm in. More so when I'm sitting at home. Like if I'm going to the cinemas, I'll actively seek out films to see. But if I'm sitting at home and choosing something that I want to watch, it really depends on the mood I'm in. Like the other day, I sat down and watched All the Old Knives after listening to your podcast, and then went back and listened to the spoiler section. And I thoroughly enjoyed that film. Usually I'd probably lean towards more some of the bigger films, but recently I've been really getting involved with some more of those lower, not lower scale, but just smaller scale introspective sort of ones. So it really depends for me. Yeah, the mood I'm in, I guess. But like I love everything from, as I've already said, Bond all the way through to Le Carre, even the Tom Clancy films. I mean, there's some of them I wouldn't call them necessarily good adaptations of the source material. Speaking the Michael B. Jordan one, that was nothing like the book. I'm a massive fan of the books, but they're obviously Hollywood's got to do their thing and make something that's going to sell, and it's sexy and it's a big revenge flick and whatever. You can see why that one was in development hell for so long and why they held on to it, and it ended up just going straight to streaming rather than getting a cinematic release like it was supposed to. It really depends. Like, I mean, I wouldn't go out and personally, I wouldn't go and choose something like XXX to go and watch. But then, I listened to you guys talk about the third one recently and I went, shit, okay. People actually really enjoyed this. It was Scott, who you had on the show, was like defending the crap out of it. All right, I'm going to go and have to find this movie now and watch it. It's such a rich genre of different styles that you can find a film that suits the mood that you're in, or suits to scratch the itch that you've got for whatever it is.
When a published film critic who writes for Forbes actually actively asks you to come on your show to talk about XXX3, you got to let him do it, and you got to let him do it well. So we just gave Scott the domain to talk about, and I just sat there and watched. But to be fair, I have a soft spot for those XXX films.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the second one's a bit of a miss compared to the first one, but still, they're good fun.
The first and third.
Didn't we disavow the second one?
No, we didn't. We just decided it was too, it's middle of the road bad. It's not. It's not that next level horrible that makes the disavowed list.
Well, speaking of, I guess, that film and the creator who made that, the Lee Tamahori's, he's done a couple of spy films. I'll round it out now with a very controversial question, I should say, a very controversial question. If you had to watch one of Lee Tamahori's 2 spy films, Die Another Day or Triple X2, what would it be?
I mean, Die Another Day, I could learn to like it if I had the time. And I'm committing myself to apparently watching that movie a lot, so I'll take Die Another Day.
I will also join Cam on the invisible car driving around Antarctica or wherever it was. Die Another Day is a bad Bond film. But this is the thing that with Die Another Day that you realize, and with things like Quantum of Solace and Casino Royale 67, its worst, Bond films are never bad films. They're just mostly mediocre. Die Another Day, Diamonds Are Forever. I mean, they have their offensive bits, but they're still fun to be found, and there's usually good action sequences, and the cinematography is usually up to standard. Now, I don't like his CG, but I could not make myself watch Ice Cube try to act through another 2 hours of State of the Union whilst he sits in a green box and everything else CG'd around him. That sequence with him in the car riding up to the train is absolutely brutal. If people think that the Bond on the iceberg surfing is bad, go and watch some of the CG sequences he did 2 years after that, I will remind you, in State of the Union, and he somehow got worse.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go with you guys there. I mean, I'm a Die Another Day defender, so that's always going to have a special place in my heart. But gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the show today. Where can listeners of this show find you online and find out more about what you do?
Well, the good thing about us is wherever you're listening to this show right now, you can also find Spyhards. Just search for Spyhards, Spyhards. Or on social media. Again, we are spies, but we're incredibly easy to track down. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok for some reason, Spyhards, or go to spyhards.com and you can find out more.
Fantastic. Well, guys, I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time this morning, and I'll definitely leave links to all of your accounts in the show notes of this as well. So gentlemen, thank you again. Cam, Scott, I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, live and let spy.
Thanks for having us, Josh.
Thanks again to Cam and Scott for coming on the show. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did recording this one. If you want to find out more about Spyhards, you can find links to their social media and the podcast in the show notes of this episode. You can also find me, your host Josh Gay, on social media at 007Oz, which is at 007AUS. And you can find Selling Secrets on social media, on Instagram at Selling Secrets Pod, or on Facebook if you just search in Selling Secrets Podcast. Thank you very much for listening to Selling Secrets, and I'll see you on the next episode.